I am Linda van Tilburg for National Security News. Carl Findlay is the co-founder of Murmur, a data-driven consultancy that analyzes socio-political topics. Well, recently, Carl examined the evolution of the big lie conspiracy theory in South Africa, which alleged vote rigging in the country's May elections. Well, today we have Carl with us to discuss his findings. Hi, Carl. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, can we have a look back at the elections in South Africa? What were this big lie conspiracy theory in South Africa, and what impact did it have on the credibility of the election, do you think?
We're obviously looking through the lens of social media, yeah, and social media is not reality, but it has a way of shaping narratives and bubbling up into the general discourse if these things are repeated enough. And I think that the two big threads or strains of interest that we saw in the social media narratives on before the elections and after the elections were the use of paid influencers to attack political opponents, and then the MK parties attempt to seed this idea of the elections being stolen. Those are the two big threads or strains of online influence that we saw going into the elections and continuing after the elections.
Can we have a look at what happened? Because you've got very interesting graphics to illustrate this.
So this is X, which for people in the industry, everyone knows that it's where it's easiest to get the data. And it's also a case of, especially in South Africa, it's the main place where political debates occur. And this is a slice of conversations around the elections. And what we found was the same players over and over, and each community is represented in a different color. And your actors that were working to debate and shape narratives were the EFF community, a community of kind of regular users that came in that were generally apolitical, coming in and critiquing of the ANC. We had a lot of paid influencers that were working to amplify different interests messages. We had the MK party's community, and especially around the time of the elections, parts of that community had actually split off due to its intense attacks of the IEC, especially around Duduzila's Zuma Sambudla. Then we had this kind of anti-foreigner bloc, which generally contains the Patriotic Alliance accounts, the Action SA accounts, a few others, and these are big proponents of the hashtag Put South Africans First, and Operation Dudula's in there as well. They all kind of grouped together. Then we had the news media, which was kind of reporting on the events. We had Gulam MV, who's a very strident, anonymous Cyril Ramaphosa supporter, and we had the DA community, and actually the Cyril Ramaphosa ANC community. And those were the voices that were all vying to have a foothold in our election. And what we saw was the MK party really promoting the idea of the elections being stolen. And they did that by starting a few days before the actual polls. On the Sunday night before, a group of MK supporters stormed a IEC storage facility and started taking videos of innocuous boxes of stored ballots and suggesting that these were being somehow pre-filled or stolen, and in some way just seeding the idea that things were not as they should be, and in that way undermining trust in the results before they even come out. And then what we saw was that got picked up by what are referred to as the EFF ground forces, and not the EFF leadership. The EFF leadership accepted the results of the elections, but a lot of its ground forces did not. And we saw that they started picking up on the day of the election, afterwards, they started picking up on the narrative that the MK party had already started seeding on the Sunday before. And so we saw the big lie narrative being seeded in this blue community and then spreading over after a few days into the ground forces of the EFF. But we also saw that the volume of conversation around that dropped off quite steeply as the conversations around the GNU and coalitions kind of took over. So they haven't had it didn't have a very long life cycle. I think that perhaps some of the pre-bunking, the early warnings of, look, this narrative is being seeded, helped to inoculate people against it, and it didn't have the lasting effect. And as we've seen now, I think the MK party has withdrawn their case about the elections being stolen. So it mirrored what we saw in the US, Bolsonaro, places like that. Very intense. It burned very intensely for a few days, but it didn't seem to have gained traction long term.
What kind of impact do you think this has? Because I remember during the election time, the MK party and EFF, they often trend on social media.
As I just said earlier, social media is not necessarily reality. In fact, it's far from reality. If X was reality, the EFF would have 45% of the vote, given the share of voice that they have on X. They definitely dominate there. And I think they definitely benefit from their ability to shape narratives on social media. But they obviously that doesn't translate into votes. And how they get value out of that, though, is that what happens in X can often be reported on in the news media, and it can often be reported on uncritically. Some journalists would say, well, this thing's trending, I'm going to report on it. They won't ask the question of where is it coming from and why might it be trending? Is it an authentic trend or not? Which are difficult questions to answer, to be fair. But those things can be reported on uncritically. They can just be taken off and reported as fact. And if those things are repeated often enough, they can enter our mainstream discourse and percolate down into people who aren't on social media, given a long enough timeline. Which is, for example, what we saw with the anti-foreigner xenophobic movement, Put South Africans First, hashtag Put South Africans First. That was a campaign that was launched on the 27th of April, 2020. That hashtag did not exist before that day. And then on that day, several thousand uses of it sprung up overnight. And that's a 4-year campaign. That started 4 years ago. So if you want to think about how these things impact, what the timescales of the impact are, they're not necessarily immediate, but with enough consistency and regularity, they can become part of our national discourses. In the early days of hashtag Put South Africans First, they tried to organize marches and 10 people would show up. And they would do it week after week after week after week after week. And there was just no one showing up, even though there was this seeming massive movement online. There was no real on-the-ground support for it. It took them a couple of years of persistence to build up their on-the-ground movement, which is Operation Dudula, as opposed to the online component, which is hashtag Put South Africans First. So these things do have real-world impact. Sometimes it can be fast. Sometimes it takes a long time and a lot of persistence.
Can we look at the people who were spreading these the big lie theory? Because Zuma's daughter was very prominent, wasn't she?
Yeah, she's the main point of influence for anything MK related, and it was the main influencer along with a few other influencers, historically RFC aligned influencers, now MK influencers. It's not surprising. It's the people that you expect to be there doing these things. People are consistent in what they say, and especially if you're trying to affect influence in a population or a country, the repetition works. Consistency works. So there were no big surprises in who did what in South Africa's elections. Everyone played to type and behaved exactly as we expected them to.
Well, these are the known faces. What about the ones that aren't known? So, were they anonymous accounts?
No, the same big influential accounts that have driven narratives. Look, the MK party has a preponderance of large influential anonymous accounts. More so, I think, than most other communities. But they've been there for years. You've got to remember that organization and that faction has a long-term history of using covert influence operations going at least back to 2016 with the Gupta bots. Gupta bots were their positioning was defined in meetings between Jacob Zuma and Bell Pottinger, who, for the record, as far as we know, had no hand in the Gupta bots. In fact, there's email records which show that when the Gupta bots came to the light of Bell Pottinger, they actually suggested that if the Zuma Gupta faction has anything to do with these, they should turn them off and distance themselves from them. I think Bell Pottinger gets a bad rap for just how involved they were. They were bad at choosing their clients, but there's no evidence to suggest that they had any hand in actual covert influence operations. From what we understand, their contribution was traditional PR positioning kind of stuff. Anyway, so that faction goes back to 2016, the use of covert methodologies, and the kinds of influences that lead those conversations have been around for a long time. Some of them are known, some of them are not known, and it's the same kind. And some of them are very public political figures, and those were the ones that led those conversations. There were no real surprises. Possibly the amount of retweets and likes and things that they received might have been artificially amplified, but it's not clear that that's the case either. It's more likely that this is an echo chamber that has been built up through intentional means over many, many years, and it has built up an audience of real people, as is the case in the US. Even if a lot of the MAGA communities are built up through inauthentic means, the audiences now are authentic. It's what happens the world over is actors, geopolitical actors, local actors, they use inauthentic means to build echo chambers of real people, and then they weaponize those. And we as members of these echo chambers, we don't realize that we are part of an echo chamber. We just know that we're surrounded by people who think like us, who've pointed us towards the other, that is the enemy, have furnished us with the arguments that we can use to debate the other. And we don't realize how homogenized those are, and the way in which we've been purposefully separated and pitted against each other on all sides, left, right, up, down, radical, not. And that is a dynamic that is happening in every country in the world. And that's a dynamic that's happening in South Africa. So, yeah.
You said that a lot of these influencers are paid. So who pays them? In South Africa in particular, do you think?
So I think the main thing is this kind of weaponization of echo chambers. And echo chambers get built for a few reasons. You might be an apolitical, mercenary, sell to the highest bidder, paid influencer. You might sell access to your echo chamber, your network of influencers, to brands, political parties, and you don't really mind. And sometimes that's what we saw in the elections. There are some paid influencers who would say one thing that was pro Action SA one day, and then pro EFF the next day, and pro MK the day after. I'm not saying that those people paid them. All you can look at is, it's hard to say where the money flows, but if you look at who they promote and who they attack, you can infer things. So those are just business people. They're just, this is their hustle, their grift. And in a non-election season, you might see them promoting a TV channel on DSTV, or a local fashion brand or DJ or something like that. So they're just completely hired guns that have a network that they've built up and curated over time, and that network then gets used to amplify whatever their clients' needs are. Then you get the other kind, which are ideological networks that have been built up with a specific political agenda in mind. An example of that are arguably was the radical economic transformation project in South Africa. The anti-foreigner for South Africa's first movement, that in the beginning, the individuals building that network were only doing that. They weren't focused on selling access to and their skills to others, although later on they did try to pivot into the more commercial side of things. And so that's what we saw in the elections. We saw political parties buying access to paid influencers networks to attack their opponents. I don't want to say too much about that because it's also difficult to, without seeing the money flow, it's circumstantial. If a hashtag springs up overnight, attacking one political party and promotes the regalia of another political party, it's pretty clear who's benefiting. But just to be safe, I won't mention names. But that's what we saw. Is in the run-up to the elections, they saw parties engaging the services of paid influencers to attack other parties. I'm sure they also used it just to amplify their own messaging. And then after the elections, we saw paid influencers mostly being used to attack the certain coalition options and promote other coalition options, and then later still to undermine the GNU.
Do you see a sort of a surge in anti-GNU kind of sentiment or tweets?
That was definitely one of the campaigns that were run. So you have these. Like the week before was party on party attacks and seeding the big lie. Week after was promoting different coalition configurations, and then the third week was, the third phase was specifically around the GNU constitutional makeup, which was very similar to the second one. Those were the three phases in which paid influencers were used.
What kind of lessons do you think there is in this for other countries that have elections? Like the big one is coming, the United States in November.
One of the things that we've been saying a lot is we would be asked to measure elections, and we'd be engaged a month, 3 weeks before the elections start. And what we would say is, well, chances are it's probably a bit too late. I don't think you're going to see, most countries won't see an inundation of new faces and voices the day before the election. It's the way online influence works is that local proxies are used, and it's the same voices over and over. Actors show their hand long before we get to an election, and you should believe them. What people say online and what they've been saying online for the last 2-3 years is what they're going to say around the elections, and everyone knows where the vectors of influence are going to come from. You might have geopolitical actors bolstering up local proxies and sharing resources and training and things like that, but it's not like all of a sudden 1 million bots are going to rush in from a foreign country and sway elections on the day of elections. These things are long-term, medium and long-term things that have already been set in place. These strategies are medium and long-term strategies that have already been affected. The narratives that have been seeded in the run-up to the elections will be the narratives that will be heightened during the period of the elections. There might be extra resources that will come into play to further amplify them, but everyone knows already who's going to say what and do what. And if you're not measuring it already, or aware of it already, or planning for it already, you shouldn't be picking it up in the last minute.
Can I ask you a last question? The US recently took down a lot of sites on X through legislation. So what has X or Twitter been doing, and what can governments do to ensure that elections are free and fair, or these voices are silenced?
It's a tough question, and obviously, it's not all about X. TikTok has a big role to play.
Oh yeah, of course.
It depends on which faction. If you're more kind of pro MAGA, pro Russia, conservative, libertarian. You'll probably get a lot of information from Telegram, which is a very specific vector of influence, but quite impactful within certain groups. Obviously, there's dark social media with like WhatsApp, which no one can measure effectively. Different platforms have different effects. I think with Facebook, conversations happen in groups that are private that can't be measured. Impact comes through advertising targeting, as we saw with Cambridge Analytica. TikTok has an amazingly impactful algorithm that puts people into very specific echo chambers very quickly. So they all have different roles to play. X is the public square. It's the only place where you can. It's the digital speaker's corner. Like in London, you can go to speaker's corner. If you've got something to say, you can put up a soapbox and you can shout to the world. That's what X is. It's an open room. If someone wants to come by and listen to you, they can. And that's where people espouse whatever they want to say. There's obviously a perennial debate around what are the limits of free speech, and a lot of the recent signals out of X through Elon Musk is that he's a free speech absolutist and he doesn't want to take things offline and whatnot. And X has come under a lot of criticism for having less moderation than before. Our experience in these elections has been that they've been one of the least responsive to egregious content that's clearly wrong. You know, they seem to have taken far more of a hands-off approach. And I get the feeling that they will do that until they are forced to do that by government policy, which again walks the very tenuous line of what is free speech and when is government policy actually an extension of ideology. So I'm glad I don't have to make those decisions.
Carl Findlay, thanks so much. That was so interesting.
Thanks for having me.